Our opinion towards this question is that it was morally wrong for the hospital to remove the baby from the care of the nurse. The main reason for this is that circumstances external to patient care were allowed to affect what should have been primarily a medical decision, and this is something that we will justify in the framework of the operation of the institution. So the first main complexity in this case has to do with the operation of the institution. We have doctors, we have nurses, we have the supervisor who is involved in making the decision in the first place. There's a relationship between the parents and the child. But our case is that the state of ethics currently of the medical profession do give us a decently clear picture of what the decision should be, of what is expected of the various parties involved in this situation. So on the face of it, the dilemma presented to us is that the medical obligation to care, for the child, to provide care on terms which are the best to the patient, seems to be in conflict with the decision that society as a whole has made, that the hospital has made in its own code of ethics, that racial discrimination should not be easily accepted or accepted at all, actually. So overall, I think the line is clear about the racial discrimination question. So as I mentioned, in the law, whether it's the Civil Rights Act, in the ethics of the institution, the ethics of the profession, whether it's for nurses, whether it's for doctors, whether it's for healthcare administrators, they all agree that race should not be a factor in terms of either rendering care or even in treating the workers who are facilitating the operation of the institution. Right. So to move on to some substantial points, first of all, let us review the state of the ethics. I would propose to look at what the code says for doctors, what the code says for the nurses, what the code says for hospitals. On the face of it, what the code says for doctors may not appear to be the most relevant, but its bearing on the case is significant because the medical ethics of the American Medical Association are pretty much the most comprehensive and actively propounded, most widely and actively agreed on code, and it's very influential in terms of the decisions that are made about who to treat and how to treat and interprofessional relations, right? And the specific part of interest to me is Opinion 3.02, which is on interprofessional relationship with nurses. Okay, so this gives us a clue about how the nurses in this situation were constrained. So what 3.02 says that the nurse's duties are primarily to render care and to follow the orders of the attending physician and essentially just support the doctor. It does say that in situations which are ethically problematic or situations which compromise medical or nursing practice, the doctor is bound to hear the nurse out, but the doctor says the final say. And this is reflected as well in what the American Nurses Association ethics say about the role of nurses. Primarily, they facilitate the operation of the institution, they support the healthcare efforts of everyone else. And what does it say specifically about morally compromising situations? It says in provision 5, for these sort of situations, that the nurse's duties to self is the same as it is to others. So they have the responsibility to protect their own integrity, to protect their own safety. One of the when it comes specifically to situations which compromise standards of moral standards or professional standards, then what the provision endorses is for the nurse to express conscientious objection to what is being done. There is some leeway here, right, in terms of what form this expression should take. So this is the room that's granted for the nurse. I imagine it to be along the lines of they can express verbally that they feel that it might be wrong, but they might be bound to go through with the procedure anyway because of the complexity of it, or they might choose not to participate in it. That might be an extreme interpretation of expression. But what room it doesn't give is for them to say that, okay, this is the decision we need to make about this patient right now, about the situation right now, this is what we're supposed to do. This is not what is provided for in the ethics of the Nursing Association, right? Another another one which might be particularly relevant to this case is about institutional practices as a whole, which fail, which promote things which are against the welfare and integrity of nurses. And again, what is propounded by the Nursing Association is that the nurses should collectively express their concerns to the relevant body or to collectively conscientiously object. Again, we see the agency of the nurses as circumscribed in a certain way, right? Within the institution, their main role is to facilitate and support. Okay, how this is relevant to our case is that in the difficult situation that was faced, there is no doubt that the supervisor faced some pressure from the parent, was in a tough spot, but what was the nurse's responsibility and what agency and what room did the nurse have to go ahead to proceed with? There wasn't very much. Overall, I think the burden was on the institution and on the supervisor to ensure that a good decision was made. And this brings us to the central question, right? What was a good decision in this case? And that has to do with the medical welfare of the baby. So the decision made to put up the sign, right, meant that in the event that something was going wrong, right, where the baby needed urgent medical attention, the nurse's ability to respond would have been compromised. Either she would be guilty of not fulfilling her medical responsibility, and that's central to all medical ethics, whether it's for doctors or for nurses or for hospitals, or she would have gone against an injunction by the institution. So for those reasons, yeah, the hospital was wrong to have taken that action, and probably many other actions should have been considered, should have been taken, and in my opinion, it's not demonstrated that they did look for all those options, such as getting other people involved, getting other administrators involved, or other help to deal with a difficult situation. Right. So to sum up, if we are to evaluate the medical need here, the medical need of the baby, relative to the issue of discrimination and race, right? We actually see that dilemma as a false one. They both concord in that for the hospital to have put up that sign and to have prevented the nurse from exercising care, it was doubly wrong. Another thing that we gain from looking at the state of ethics overall is about the nurses' place in the institution. What the nurses eventually sued the hospital for was under the hostile work environment laws. And because I would argue that this was actually appropriate, based on what the Ethics of Nursing Association kind of recommend, that they should object, they should express their concern, but they couldn't directly undermine the operation in the process of it. It is also, it seems appropriate to look at the issue as employee welfare issue in this case, and that the decision of the supervisor or the hospital affected the working conditions of the people who knew what job they had to do, knew that they had to do it, but in the end found that they were prevented from doing so. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Team B, you guys have 1 minute to prepare starting now. And that's one. You have 5 minutes to present.
Okay, cool, thank you. Well, we'd like to thank Hogan College for the case that they presented. Of course, the judges for being here, parents, coaches, thank you guys for being here with us. So the question is, was it morally wrong for the hospital to remove the baby from the care of the nurse And we disagree with you guys on this point. We don't think it was more than wrong for the hospital to put another nurse in charge of the baby, but we do think that it could have been handled in a better manner, and so we disagree with the way in which it handled. So we're saying that it's morally permissible, but there's a more morally optimal way in which to have handled the situation. We want to make a clarification too, of course. Racial discrimination, racism should never be tolerated, and we firmly disagree with the racial discrimination displayed on the part of the father of the child, and who strongly requested a different nurse and even flashed a swastika on his arm. We're gonna talk about that right now. So I'm gonna give it off to Max.
I appreciate your case, but it seems to be some sort of failure in providing a theoretical stance to help clarify why the hospital was morally wrong. There was no methodology given, and no theory given, other than appealing to legal statutes, which you did a great job at, but legal statutes don't suffice when it comes to making moral decisions entirely. They do help provide tools, guidelines to make moral decisions, but they can't suffice on their own.
So I'm going to give a little commentary on your case as well. So first of all, you mentioned that this case is mainly medical in the sense that doctors should not be able to discriminate and say, I'm not going to take care of this patient because of their race or because of their gender or because of their, or any other defining factor such as that. Well, we do definitely agree. We disagree in the sense that a patient should have some sort of right to determine what doctor is going to take care of them. We're not, once again, we're not condoning the racism of the father. What we're saying is that there are some cases in which a patient may request that a different caretaker be given to them. For instance, in the case of a Hispanic patient who requests a Spanish-speaking nurse because that nurse is able to communicate better with them, or a female patient who requests who requests that she does not get a male gynecologist because she feels more comfortable with a female. So, if you want to hand it over to you.
Yeah, and just to briefly touch on that, it seems like your case was heavily relying upon this professional code of ethics. And I think I want to identify the professional code of ethics that you're mentioning to, or alluding to, is the American Medical Association of Ethics, which prescribes that a professional caretaker, whether a nurse or physician or some other general practitioner of some sort, may never discriminate in who they treat based on gender, race, or any other distinguishing factor in how we distinguish human beings from one another. But it does not apply to that of a patient's request in asking for a member of a different race, gender, or what have you. And also, I would like to delve into now some positive arguments that would support our thesis. And that the first being titled the looming threat. The looming threat, as you'll see begin in life, is that when Stefano talked about the man who rolled up his sleeve and showed the Nazi swastika, which created tension in the room, when he told the supervisor, "I want a different nurse," he said, "I want a black nurse treating my child." So obviously, there's a situation that has escalated where there's now a threat. A threat not only to Tony Vallis, but other nurses in the environment if his demands aren't met. So if we look at this as minimizing the harm from a utilitarian perspective, that they want to minimize the harm, that is a good thing to go ahead and diffuse the situation and get Tony Vallis out of there as soon as possible and out of harm's way. And the second argument is the general welfare of the hospital community, and that maximize the good in protecting the nurses that were also in the room as well from this man and his hostile aggression if his demands were not met. And it also provided for the welfare of the baby. The baby is a neonatal intensive care unit due to the fact that it has either born prematurely or some other treatments that necessitate immediate care. So given the emergency situation, the request of the father was deemed morally permissible that be met or addressed versus being ignored given the emergency, given the urgency of the situation. But if there's a non-emergency situation, we don't see why the hospital should act in that way. But given that it was an emergency,
You can finish that sentence.
given the fact that it was an emergency, it prompted an immediate and urgent response. Thank you.
Thank you. Team A, you guys have 1 minute to prepare a response. Sorry. You're welcome to begin. Sure.
Okay.
5 minutes.
All right. Thanks for the questions. I'll try my best to address all of them. Okay. So one question was about one doubt they expressed was that we appealed more to legal statutes rather than moral guidelines. I guess the first point of fact is that we referred to mainly the professional ethics of doctors, nurses, etc. There's a legal thing in the background. But the main point I want to make is that, if our ethics, which we've agreed on for a profession, for a certain community, the laws we agree on as a society, are not going to be a guide for our moral decisions, then what is? So I guess that's my main difficulty in accepting this doubt. Nevertheless, you did raise like many other points about other concerns, other ways we can conceive of harm and ill being done among the various parties. So the first one has to do with the right of a patient to request a certain variety of care. I think the example given was about requesting, let's say, a Spanish-speaking nurse, for instance. One way that's fundamentally different from this case is that whereas maybe communication in your home language might have some practical value in providing patient care, I don't think the race of the nurse can be said to have the same effect. So that's one point. Another one is that I would agree, right, that the duty to render medical care should be prioritized over some other, moral or ethical principles in some situations. For example, in a desperate situation, right, if a patient comes in and says, no, I only want to be treated by such and such a person, then what actually the existing culture is that doctors and the hospitals will accommodate it. It's kind of sad, but it's true. At the same time, I'm of the opinion that when they do that, when they prioritize their duty to render care over the other one, it doesn't make the wrong in terms of discrimination, any less wrong, right? Another question, or another point made was about the ethics that were brought up. And I guess just to clarify the point of fact, the AMA one is quite doctor-centric. The second one we brought in was the American Nurses Association one. So there are a variety of ethics. And the last one, which the question actually bears most directly on, has to do with, was it morally wrong for the hospital, right? And this is the point that I want to focus on more. And here the state of ethics is actually the most problematic. It's quite fragmented. I mean, there are so many professional training bodies, so many schools which are supposed to train healthcare executives, administrators, etc., but they all have kind of different ones. Where they concord though in important points about discrimination, about the burden to care, I think those points we brought up in our substantial case. Yep. Another question has to do with the threat or safety that was potentially posed to the nurses. And I guess my question here is, or my doubt here is that it needed to be further demonstrated that the hospital took due diligence to explore those options. So for instance, if physical harm was going to be a real possibility, why wasn't security called in, for instance? Right? Why was the concession made quite so quickly? Certainly stress may have been a factor, certainly time may have been a factor. But again, I think to judge that the supervisor failed to uphold an ethical standard is a fair judgment. Yeah, I think those are my. Okay, last one about 1 minute. Right, one more question was about the neonatal and intensive care thing. Actually, the case seemed to be what our research of the case turns out is that it wasn't a critical emergency situation, right? So because, in fact, the ruling was that because the situation wasn't medically desperate, the supervisor wasn't therefore justified, in taking the action that he did. So that was kind of the court or the lawyer's argument at one point. And another point that was suggested to me by my teammate was that if it was in fact critical, this would have been even more medically dangerous. I mean, if the nurse couldn't attend to a fullest extent, wouldn't that be a failure of the system then? Yeah, so those are our responses. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, judges. You have 1 minute to confer and 10 minutes to present one question plus one follow-up. That's 1 minute, judges. Am I gonna have to break the?
Okay, yeah.
Your 10 minutes begin now.
Okay, the sort of the parts of those various codes, it was a tad surprising to me to hear you sort of appealing to those particular parts of the code, because it seemed to me the sort of the two issues you were addressing is one, whether what was the sort of their obligation in terms of providing the best care to the infant, that was the one, and the second one was their obligation to the nurses in terms of discrimination. So I expected you to partly, there were two questions there. So I wonder if you could sort of appeal to the code more directly to talk about first the child. I mean, are there sort of parts of the code that are more obvious that tell us about what we should do with respect to patients? And then secondly, are there sort of parts of the code that are a little more straightforward that tell us something about the responsibility towards the healthcare staff?
Okay. All right. To answer kind of the first question about are there parts of the code which pertain very, very directly to care for the child? Yes, but those tend to be along the lines of how does the manner of delivery kind of differ, more than about how the rights and duties of the doctor or the nurse or whatever changes towards the child as compared to the parents. So this case does kind of fall within a tricky spot in terms of what is explicitly specified. So for that reason, that I chose to focus rather on the function of the institution instead. So where does the judgment reside? Where does the responsibility for the judgment about how the care should be delivered in a tough situation reside? I feel that goes down to the hospital's operation, and which is why I focus on certain parts of it. When it comes to other specific features of the case, for example, like whether race is a factor, things like that, it's a lot easier when the patient is an adult, that he's not making the decision directly for the child. The ethics in this case kind of have prompted the current culture in the operation of medical institutions to accommodate. So if a patient makes a racist request nowadays on its own behalf, what happens is that most of the time the hospitals do accommodate. So those are there are explicit stipulations here about rendering care which apply very directly. It gets complicated for the child. And I think one question here might be about the agency of the parent over the child's welfare. Yeah.
I'm going to encourage you to see the forest for a minute.
Okay.
Okay. To think more, again, about sort of the step back a little bit. A more really obvious part of all of these codes is putting the patient first.
Yeah.
So, so the primary obligation is to do what's in the best interest of the patient. Can you talk about this case from that perspective? I mean, that's just what's in the best interest of the, and you did sort of, as you went through here, but can you sort of be more specific about that? And then secondly, is there another part that's sort of less, less more, let's put it this way,
Yeah.
more direct, this sort of helps us to think about sort of how members of the healthcare team are supposed to treat each other with
Yeah.
respect or something like
Right.
that.
Okay, holistically, I think my moral judgment is in kind of a difficult spot in that there may not have been a very moral action that could have been taken because of constraints of resources, because of constraints of time. So I think the supervisor's decision to, care for, to accede to the patient's request in this case is understandable, right? It is justified by the consequences of whether the child got care in the best possible time. But I think at the same time, my judgment would be that it's fair that this was a failing of ethical standards, and perhaps there are failure to uphold ethical standards, and perhaps that means reviewing those standards and those frames to some extent, which bears on your second question about how the various parties should have treated each other. What's the standing of the nurses and the supervisor and doctors. I think what seems to be a little bit lacking is in terms of supervisors' awareness or consideration of their duties or their responsibilities towards the nurses who are bound to care. This is reflected in the action in this case to some extent. It's also reflected, I think, from the state of the ethics. It's the most fragmented one, right? The ethics for various hospitals, for administrators, for executives. So perhaps that is one area of ethics that needs review.
To just touch on your first point, that you were concerned that maybe the baby wouldn't get care if the hospital refused the demands of the parent. We determined that the baby was not in a emergency situation, and if the parent refused care for their child, then that's a situation where social services could become involved.
Let's ignore what the law might offer or what relief there might be and talk about the moral implications of that. If you make the morally right decision and refuse the bad man's request, and there's a consequence, which is the baby suffers, are you morally culpable?
Yeah. Okay. I think my response here is that it is primarily going to have to be the parents who are culpable. So that's my opinion. In this case, the hospital, would is not absent of responsibility. I mean, if they could not achieve some sort of agreement with the parent, then if I were to evaluate that case, I would probably say something like there's a failure to establish a basis for a moral decision. Yeah, probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the hospital does have the ability to get social services involved.
Yeah, sometimes these are easier questions when we take out the practical realities and we just deal with the moral issues. But I think you're right that in general, you shouldn't, making the right moral decision absolves you from moral culpability for not bending to the bad man's request. I think is what your first answer was.
3 minutes.
I want to go back to that. It seems that there's a contradiction, so I'm inviting you to clear it up and then following up with his question. You first stated that it was morally wrong to remove the baby from the nurse's care, but then later you said that you, in the given situation, because of the antagonism of the parents and the possibility of the baby getting removed, that it might have been in the best interest of the baby to remove the nurse because of the things we've already talked about. How can you put those two together? Because how could it be morally right to do something that might inflict harm on a baby?
I think there's a second stage in between here, which has to be desperate situations. So I think in a desperate situation, it is right to prioritize the need to render care. I think there is an order in our priorities of which moral principle to uphold. In that case, the care one would probably outrank the discrimination one, and so that's the second step. The third step about the practical realities in this case, whether the supervisor responded well under pressure, whether the welfare overall was upheld. I think this is it's a harder one to answer. I still believe that it was wrong, like morally speaking, and by the ethics which have been already laid out as guidelines, where what it seems to show me is that perhaps the framework for, the ethical frameworks governing cases which fall in this zone might need further review. The institutional practices need to be strengthened to some extent. I mean, in this case, perhaps there was a lack of resources. Perhaps there was no counselor, no administrator who could have dealt with the parent, in which case then the supervisor's responsibility or moral responsibility would have been mitigated. But I still think that that would still be a falling short of what the rest of the ethics of the hospital and the profession stipulate.
45 seconds for a brief
Yeah,
follow-up.
brief follow-up. The medical ethics really determine who gets care from the hospital and care and treatment from the hospital. Not so much, but that's not, I don't think, germane to this case, because they're not denying care to somebody based on race. It's actually the opposite direction. So
Yeah.
can you briefly reconcile that?
That's why I think for me the focus is on the ethics governing the running of the hospital. So administration, executive decisions, that's where it's most fragmented. And you're right to point out that most of it in the doctor's ethics and nurse's ethics goes in the other direction, that they can't discriminate in care. So that's another reason.
Can you finish that thought?
Yeah, that's another reason I kind of focus more on interprofessional relations than